Welcome, traveler. I am Jungle James, your guide here at the Academy of Sleep. We bring you slow, thoughtful lectures, ideal companions for bedtime. Before the tale unfolds, I ask only this: subscribe, and leave a token of your visit with a like. And now, let the story begin. The Great Migration, when barbarians changed the world. Chapter 1. A world on the brink of great change. The world, at the twilight of the 4th century, was vast, ancient, and weary. In the east, the Roman Empire still flickered with imperial splendor, its cities of marble standing proud beneath the Mediterranean sun. In Constantinople, once Byzantium, silk-clad courtiers whispered in shadowed halls, and golden mosaics gleamed above the heads of chanting priests. The old order still stood, but cracks had begun to spread across the face of the world. Beyond the Rhine and the Danube, in the deep forests and windswept plains of Germania and Scythia, a quiet storm was building. There, beneath the canopies of oak and ash, lived peoples the Romans had long called barbarians, a term used not with understanding, but with distance. The Visigoths and Ostrogoths, the Vandals, Burgundians, Alans, Suebi, and countless lesser-known tribes, all etched their lives into landscapes of cold rivers and dense woods, speaking strange tongues and practicing laws born not in marble courts, but in smoky longhouses. For centuries, the Roman frontier had held, sometimes with steel, sometimes with diplomacy, sometimes with gold. Trade, tribute, and war coexisted in uneasy balance. Gothic chieftains might offer soldiers for the emperor's legions, while Roman envoys brought wine and silver to the camps of tribal kings. But beneath the surface of these exchanges, deeper forces were stirring. Climate was changing. Crops failed more often in the north. Herds moved. Populations grew restless. And somewhere far to the east, in the endless grasslands beyond the Volga River, something was moving. Fast. A people unlike any the Romans had seen were coming. They would soon be known as the Huns, and they were riding westward like a shadow on the horizon. In the year 376, a moment came that many historians mark as the true beginning of the Great Migration period. A vast group of Visigoths, seeking refuge from the Huns, appeared on the banks of the Danube, pleading for entrance into the Roman Empire. The Romans agreed, but they did not understand what they had invited in. Poorly managed, brutally exploited, the starving Goths rose in rebellion. 2 years later, in 378, the Roman Emperor Valens fell at the Battle of Adrianople, a defeat so crushing that the echo of its shock waves would be felt for centuries. From this moment onward, the map of Europe would never rest. Tribes would move, merge, clash, and carve new identities from the bones of a dying empire. Rome, which had ruled for over 1,000 years, began to unravel not all at once, but like a tapestry slowly fraying at the edges. Cities that once echoed with the thunder of legionnaires now heard the chants of foreign tongues and the clatter of new warriors' boots. And yet, this was not a tale only of destruction. It was also a time of transformation, of new beginnings born from old endings. The migrations that followed would lay the seeds for the kingdoms of medieval Europe. In the ash of crumbling empires, new cultures would rise, blending Roman legacy with Germanic roots. As the stars turned slowly over a restless continent, a new chapter of history began to write itself, not in Latin, but in many voices on the march. Let us now follow those voices. Let us walk the shifting roads of late antiquity, where no border was fixed and no future certain. A world was ending, and another was just beginning. Chapter 2. Europe, before the Great Migration. By the end of the 3rd century and the beginning of the 4th, Europe stood like a mosaic of contrasts, rich and brittle, ancient and uncertain. In the south stretched the grandeur of the Roman world, its roads still binding together cities and provinces from Hispania to Syria. Though no longer unified as one solid empire, the East and West remained cousins in culture and blood, sharing gods, laws, and architecture. In Rome itself, the emperors still processed in silk and gold, though behind them trailed the whispers of debts, intrigues, and empty coffers. Beyond the imperial borders, the lands of the so-called barbarians unfolded like an untamed tapestry. Dense forests of Germania, misty coasts of Britannia, broad steppes stretching eastward into lands barely mapped. Here, among towering trees and fire-warmed longhouses, tribal life pulsed with its own rhythm. Clans gathered under chieftains, settled blood feuds with ancient custom, and whispered old songs beneath the stars. Their ways were not written in books, but remembered in bones, in names passed down like fire, in sagas told by the hearth. Yet even as the Romans and the tribes maintained a wary distance, they were not strangers. For generations, trade had flowed in both directions. Roman coins and glassware made their way into Gothic graves. Germanic slaves, captives, and mercenaries crossed into Roman cities, serving in kitchens, stables, and more often on battlefields. Borderland towns became places of fusion. Noricum, Pannonia, Dacia, regions where Roman stone met wooden walls, where Latin words mingled with Germanic speech. Still, Rome had grown weaker. The crisis of the 3rd century had already exposed deep fractures. Emperors rose and fell in rapid succession. Civil wars scarred the land, and plagues emptied cities. Reforms by emperors like Diocletian and Constantine brought temporary order, but they came with costs. The empire became more militarized, more autocratic, less able to adapt. Tax burdens grew unbearable. Small landowners abandoned their farms, drifting toward cities or seeking protection from powerful landlords. The old civic spirit, the Roman res publica, dimmed. Meanwhile, the empire's boundaries stretched thin. The Rhine and Danube, long the frontier of Roman might, now required more than stone walls. They needed constant watching, bribes, and treaties. Foederati, barbarian allies, were settled along borders in exchange for loyalty and military service. These agreements, forged out of necessity, would one day give birth to kings and kingdoms. Religion, too, was changing the soul of Europe. Christianity, once persecuted, now basked in imperial favor. By the early 4th century, under Constantine the Great, the faith of the martyrs became the faith of emperors. Bishops gained influence, basilicas rose beside temples, and Christian doctrine began to shape not only hearts, but laws and governance. Yet this new unity also brought fresh divisions, heresies, rival sects, and growing tensions between the Latin West, Greek East. The countryside was dotted with villages and villas. The cities, once the pride of Roman order, had become shadows of their past, their forums half empty, their aqueducts crumbling. In Gaul and Hispania, Roman provincial identity still held, but it was slowly fraying. In Britannia, the legions would soon depart entirely, leaving the island to its own fate. And in the east, the jewel of Constantinople rose above the Bosphorus. More than a city, it was a statement of intent. Here, emperors believed they could continue the Roman story anew, blending Hellenistic grace, Roman engineering, and Christian vision into a different future. Yet even this city would not remain untouched by the coming tide. Europe before the Great Migration was a continent in quiet tension, an aging world dressed in fading grandeur, watched from afar by restless eyes. The people beyond the frontier did not yet dream of kingdoms or crowns, but they knew hunger. They knew cold winters and the weight of survival. They watched the riches of Rome from the forests and the steppes, and they waited. Not yet invaders, not yet conquerors, but soon they would rise and march and shape the very bones of Europe. Chapter 3. The First Waves, the Huns and the Chain Reaction. In the deep heart of the Eurasian steppe, where grasslands stretch like an endless ocean and horses sleep standing beneath the stars, a force began to gather, a force that would send tremors through the foundations of Europe. The Huns, a people of unclear origin and language, thundered westward like a storm, emerging suddenly from the mists of Asia in the late 4th century. With swift horses, taut bows, and tactics unlike anything the Roman world had faced, they descended upon the lands beyond the Danube and set into motion the great chain reaction of migrations that would come to define the age. Who were the Huns? To their enemies, they were the embodiment of fear, savage, inhuman, barely understood. To the Romans and the settled Germanic tribes, their arrival was a calamity wrapped in mystery. Some scholars suggest that the Huns may have originated in the regions beyond the Altai Mountains, perhaps with distant ties to the Xiongnu of ancient Chinese chronicles. Others argue their roots lay closer to Central Asia, but their sudden appearance around the 370s east of the Black Sea changed everything. Their warfare was unlike that of the heavy-footed legions or the shield-wielding Germanic warriors. The Huns were horse archers, trained from childhood to fire arrows with deadly accuracy at full gallop. They wore scale armor of iron and leather, their faces weathered by wind and fire. They moved with uncanny speed, foraging as they rode, traveling light and striking without warning. To fight them was to battle ghosts on horseback, vanishing before you could strike. Their first major victims were the Alans and the Ostrogoths. The Alans, a nomadic Iranian people, were shattered by the Hunnic advance. The Ostrogoths, settled east of the Dniester, tried to resist, but were crushed. Their kings fell, their society collapsed, and so they fled westward. But the most consequential encounter came when the Visigoths, another Gothic people who had long dwelt near the Danube, found themselves trapped between the Huns behind them and the Roman frontier ahead. In desperation, their leaders begged the Roman Emperor Valens for asylum. In the year 376, they were allowed to cross the Danube into Roman territory. Thousands of warriors, families, children, and elders. It was a moment of mercy, but also of unpreparedness. Once inside the empire, the situation spiraled. Roman officials extorted the newcomers, trading food for the children of Gothic nobles, treating them more as cattle than refugees. Famine and mistreatment turned suffering into rage. In 378, the tension erupted. The Visigoths revolted, and near the city of Adrianople, in what is now modern Turkey, they clashed with Roman forces. The result was one of the most devastating defeats in Roman history. Emperor Valens himself was killed, burned alive, it is said, in a farmhouse surrounded by Gothic warriors. The Roman army was annihilated. For the first time in centuries, the empire had lost an emperor and a legion not to another Roman, but to the very people it had once dismissed as savages. The world changed in that moment. The barrier had broken. The illusion of Roman invincibility shattered. And across Europe, word spread like wildfire. Rome could be entered. Rome could be broken. In the decades that followed, the Huns continued their advance, pushing other tribes before them like leaves on a river. The Vandals, Suebi, and Alans moved westward. The Burgundians shifted south. Whole peoples abandoned ancestral lands, heading toward the safer, richer, warmer provinces of Rome. It was not a single invasion, but a rolling storm, a domino effect of migration sparked by the crack of hooves and the whistle of Hunnic arrows. And still, no one truly understood the Huns. They did not build cities. They did not send envoys. They rode, raided, and vanished. Some tribes tried to ally with them, others to resist, but no strategy seemed to hold for long. The Huns were both real and spectral, nomads of the wind, horsemen of fear. Yet even in their wake, they reshaped the world. Without ever setting foot in many of the lands they influenced, the Huns forced the migrations of millions. In driving the Goths into Roman territory, they indirectly set the stage for the fall of the Western Empire. They were, in a sense, the fuse that lit the long, slow explosion of late antiquity. And they were only just beginning. Chapter 4. The Goths on the Move, a people between war and peace. Among the many tribes caught in the tremors of the Hunnic advance, it was the Goths who first stepped fully into the storm. Once, a distant people living along the Baltic shores, the Goths had migrated southward over centuries, drawn by trade, opportunity, and the growing shadow of Roman power. By the 4th century, they had split into two great branches, the Visigoths in the west and the Ostrogoths in the east, each forging its destiny on the volatile frontier of empire. The Visigoths, in particular, had long held a complicated relationship with Rome. Sometimes foes, sometimes allies. They had tasted Roman wealth and Roman betrayal in equal measure. They fought in Roman wars and adopted many of its ways. Some converted to Arian Christianity, wore Roman armor, spoke a mix of Latin and Gothic. But they remained outsiders, never fully accepted, always kept at the margins of the empire they had helped defend. Their great turning point came in the year 376, when they fled across the Danube, seeking refuge from the Huns. The Roman Empire, still clinging to illusions of order, agreed to settle them in the province of Moesia. But what followed was not peace. Starved, Mistreated, taxed, and abused by corrupt officials, the Visigoths found themselves in a prison of promises. What began as a migration soon turned to rebellion. In 378, under the leadership of Fritigern, they crushed a Roman army at Adrianople. Emperor Valens was killed. The unthinkable had occurred. A tribal army had annihilated the legions and lived to claim victory on Roman soil. In the years that followed, the Visigoths did not leave. They wandered the Balkans, raiding and surviving, but unable to find a true homeland. Rome, weary and cautious, made them foederati, federated allies with nominal loyalty to the empire. But the arrangement was uneasy. Their hearts remained Gothic, and their eyes searched for something more lasting than tribute. That something came with the rise of Alaric, a charismatic and ambitious leader who dreamed not of plunder, but of place. Alaric had served in Roman campaigns. He knew the language of courts and the ambitions of emperors, but he also knew the bitterness of promises broken and the need for his people to find soil they could call their own. Around 395, he led the Visigoths into Greece, sacking Corinth and Athens, only to be bought off with gold. Then he turned his gaze toward Italy. By 410, after years of negotiation, betrayal, and failed diplomacy, Alaric did the unthinkable. He marched on Rome itself. Once the beating heart of empire, the eternal city now lay exposed. And though it had not been the seat of imperial power for some time, its symbolic weight remained immense. The walls were high, but the spirit within had grown thin. Alaric's Goths surrounded the city, and after a long siege they broke through. On August 24th, 410, Rome was sacked. For 3 days, the Visigoths plundered. Churches were spared, but homes, palaces, and storehouses were emptied. Wealth carried on carts and shoulders. Slaves freed, nobles stripped. And yet, even in destruction, the sack of Rome was not wanton chaos. Alaric had ordered restraint. His goal was not annihilation, but leverage. He sought recognition, land for his people, a stable place within the empire. He never found it. Alaric died later that year in southern Italy, and his body, legend has it, was buried beneath a diverted river, his tomb hidden forever by waters returned to their course. His successors led the Visigoths westward, through Gaul and into Hispania. There, in the years that followed, they would finally found a kingdom in fertile lands where Roman villas crumbled and a new future could take root. The Visigothic kingdom in Hispania would last for centuries. Their laws, the Codex Euricianus, blended Roman jurisprudence with Gothic custom. Their kings ruled cities once held by Roman governors. Their coins bore Latin inscriptions, and yet they remained Gothic, preserving their language and identity even as they transformed into something new. The Ostrogoths, too, would rise, but their story, still brewing in the shadows, belonged to a later chapter. The Goths were not mere invaders. They were migrants, soldiers, settlers, kings. Between war and peace, they searched for belonging in a world collapsing around them. And in their long journey, they carried with them both the memory of empire and the seed of something else, the beginning of the medieval world. Chapter 5. The Vandals' Journey from Europe to a Kingdom in Africa. If history remembers the Vandals, it is often with a sneer. Their name, twisted by time, has become synonymous with senseless destruction. But the truth of their story is far richer, less a tale of brute violence and more one of long migration, unexpected conquest, and the fleeting brilliance of a forgotten kingdom. The Vandals were a Germanic people, originally from the region near the Oder and Vistula rivers in what is now Poland. Like many others, they were swept westward by the great upheavals of the late 4th and early 5th centuries. The pressure of the Huns rippled outward, and the Vandals, alongside their allies, the Alans, an Iranian nomadic people, joined the tide of motion that broke upon the frontiers of Rome. In the harsh winter of 406-407, a coalition of Vandals, Alans, and Suebi crossed the frozen Rhine River into Roman Gaul. It was not a conquest, but an exodus, driven by desperation, hunger, and fear. The legions, distracted by civil strife and invasions elsewhere, could not hold them back. Cities were pillaged, provinces destabilized, and the Roman presence in Gaul began to unravel. For several years, the Vandals wandered through Gaul and into Hispania, clashing with Roman and Visigothic forces alike. They carved out temporary footholds, but nothing held. Betrayals were common, treaties fleeting. Their leader, Gunderic, sought stability, but the pressure from the Visigoths, now rising in power and favored by Rome, pushed them further south. Then, in 429, a new chapter began. Under the leadership of Gunderic's half-brother Genseric, a bold and decisive king, the Vandals made a dramatic leap across continents. With a fleet of ships, some say supplied by rebellious Roman commanders, they sailed from southern Hispania across the Mediterranean to North Africa. It was a stunning move, from the forests of Europe to the sun-baked shores of Carthage. At the time, Roman Africa was a jewel of the Western Empire. The province of Africa Proconsularis, with Carthage at its heart, was fertile and rich. Grain fields, olive groves, prosperous cities. But it was also divided and poorly defended. Internal rivalries, religious conflict, and political instability left it vulnerable. In 439, Genseric seized Carthage. The fall of this ancient city, once Rome's great rival, now a prized possession, shocked the empire. Without a major battle, without a grand campaign, the Vandals had taken one of the wealthiest cities in the West, and they made it their capital. From there, they would rule for nearly a century. The Vandal kingdom was no mindless horde. Genseric organized a navy that would come to dominate the western Mediterranean. Vandal ships raided the coasts of Italy and Gaul, struck into Sicily, and even threatened Constantinople. They became a maritime power, feared and resented, but undeniably effective. Internally, their kingdom was a complex blend of cultures. The Vandals were Arian Christians, which set them apart from the Catholic Roman majority in their new African domains. This religious divide led to persecution, exile of Catholic bishops, and the closure of churches, tensions that would never fully settle. Yet commerce thrived, cities functioned, and life continued under Vandal rule. In 455, Genseric struck his most famous blow. After the assassination of the Western Roman Emperor Valentinian III, his widow, Licinia Eudoxia, reportedly called on Genseric for help. He sailed to Rome and entered the Eternal City. Though the sack of 455 was far less brutal than legend suggests, churches were spared, mass slaughter avoided, the psychological impact was immense. Rome had been humiliated once again, and this time by the very people whose name would become a byword for destruction. But kingdoms born in chaos rarely last. After Genseric's death in 477, the Vandal state began to erode. Internal strife, weak successors, and the growing power of the Eastern Roman Empire under Justinian set the stage for their downfall. In 533, the Byzantine general Belisarius landed in North Africa with a disciplined force. The Vandals, divided and unprepared, were defeated in a series of swift battles. Carthage fell. The Vandal kingdom, less than a century old, vanished into history. Yet their legacy remains, written not only in ruins and Roman polemics, but in the astonishing scope of their journey. From the misty forests of northern Europe to the palaces of Carthage, from nomadic warriors to kings of the sea, the Vandals carved a path across continents. And though they are remembered as destroyers, they were also survivors, navigating the collapse of an empire and daring, for a moment, to build a world of their own. Chapter 5. The Vandals' Journey from Europe to a Kingdom in Africa. If history remembers the Vandals, it is often with a sneer. Their name, twisted by time, has become synonymous with senseless destruction. But the truth of their story is far richer, less a tale of brute violence, and more one of long migration, unexpected conquest, and the fleeting brilliance of a forgotten kingdom. The Vandals were a Germanic people, originally from the region near the Oder and Vistula rivers, in what is now Poland. Like many others, they were swept westward by the great upheavals of the late 4th and early 5th centuries. The pressure of the Huns rippled outward, and the Vandals, alongside their allies, the Alans, an Iranian nomadic people, joined the tide of motion that broke upon the frontiers of Rome. In the harsh winter of 406-407, a coalition of Vandals, Alans, and Suebi crossed the frozen Rhine River into Roman Gaul. It was not a conquest, but an exodus, driven by desperation, hunger, and fear. The legions, distracted by civil strife and invasions elsewhere, could not hold them back. Cities were pillaged, provinces destabilized, and the Roman presence in Gaul began to unravel. For several years, the Vandals wandered through Gaul and into Hispania, clashing with Roman and Visigothic forces alike. They carved out temporary footholds, but nothing held. Betrayals were common, treaties fleeting. Their leader, Gunderic, sought stability, but the pressure from the Visigoths, now rising in power and favored by Rome, pushed them further south. Then, in 429, a new chapter began. Under the leadership of Gunderic's half-brother Genseric, a bold and decisive king, the Vandals made a dramatic leap across continents. With a fleet of ships, some say supplied by rebellious Roman commanders, They sailed from southern Hispania across the Mediterranean to North Africa. It was a stunning move, from the forests of Europe to the sun-baked shores of Carthage. At the time, Roman Africa was a jewel of the Western Empire. The province of Africa Proconsularis, with Carthage at its heart, was fertile and rich. Grain fields, olive groves, prosperous cities. But it was also divided and poorly defended. Internal rivalries, religious conflict, and political instability left it vulnerable. In 439, Genseric seized Carthage. The fall of this ancient city, once Rome's great rival, now a prized possession, shocked the empire. Without a major battle, without a grand campaign, the Vandals had taken one of the wealthiest cities in the West, and they made it their capital. From there, they would rule for nearly a century. The Vandal kingdom was no mindless horde. Genseric organized a navy that would come to dominate the Western Mediterranean. Vandal ships raided the coasts of Italy and Gaul, struck into Sicily, and even threatened Constantinople. They became a maritime power, feared and resented, but undeniably effective. Internally, their kingdom was a complex blend of cultures. The Vandals were Arian Christians, which set them apart from the Catholic Roman majority in their new African domains. This religious divide led to persecution, exile of Catholic bishops, and the closure of churches, tensions that would never fully settle. Yet commerce thrived, cities functioned, and life continued under Vandal rule. In 455, Genseric struck his most famous blow. After the assassination of the Western Roman Emperor Valentinian III, his widow, Licinia Eudoxia, reportedly called on Genseric for help. He sailed to Rome and entered the Eternal City. Though the sack of 455 was far less brutal than legend suggests, churches were spared, mass slaughter avoided, the psychological impact was immense. Rome had been humiliated once again, and this time by the very people whose name would become a byword for destruction. But kingdoms born in chaos rarely last. After Genseric's death in 477, the Vandal state began to erode. Internal strife, weak successors, and the growing power of the Eastern Roman Empire under Justinian set the stage for their downfall. In 533, the Byzantine general Belisarius landed in North Africa with a disciplined force. The Vandals, divided and unprepared, were defeated in a series of swift battles. Carthage fell. The Vandal kingdom, less than a century old, vanished into history. Yet their legacy remains, written not only in ruins and Roman polemics, but in the astonishing scope of their journey. From the misty forests of northern Europe to the palaces of Carthage, from nomadic warriors to kings of the sea, the Vandals carved a path across continents. And though they are remembered as destroyers, they were also survivors, navigating the collapse of an empire and daring, for a moment, to build a world of their own. Chapter 7. Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, a new era for the British Isles. As the Roman world crumbled on the continent, another story was unfolding across the sea, on the rain-soaked, wind-beaten shores of the British Isles. Here, in a land once governed by imperial law and traversed by legionnaires, silence was beginning to fall. The Roman province of Britannia, long isolated and difficult to defend, had been abandoned. Around the early 5th century, the last legions withdrew, leaving behind towns without governors, roads without patrols, and a people exposed. The British elite, once proud citizens of Rome, were now left to their own fate. Without imperial support, local rulers, petty kings, bishops, warlords, scrambled to fill the vacuum. Their foes were many. From the north came the Picts, painted warriors raiding from the highlands. From across the Irish Sea came the Scotti, fierce Gaelic raiders who would one day lend their name to Scotland. And then, from the misty east, came the most transformative threat of all, the seafaring tribes of the North Sea, the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. These Germanic peoples came first as mercenaries. According to the Historia Ecclesiastica of Bede, a later Anglo-Saxon monk, native British rulers invited them in as hired swords to defend against Pictish incursions. The legend names two chieftains, Hengist and Horsa, who landed in the east and were granted land in exchange for protection. But like so many stories of invited allies in this age, the arrangement quickly turned to conquest. By the mid-5th century, waves of migration began. The Anglo-Saxons, an umbrella term for the incoming Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, sailed across the Channel, bringing their families, livestock, and gods. They were not merely raiders, they came to stay. Their homes were small wooden halls, their leaders elected or chosen by might. Their language a precursor to what would one day become English. The native Romano-British population resisted. Some fought in scattered battles. Others fled westward into Wales, Cornwall, or across the sea to Brittany, land which bears their name. Among them were Christian clergy, still clinging to the remnants of the Roman Church. But the tide could not be turned. Over the course of a century, the Anglo-Saxons expanded their foothold, carving out new kingdoms in the east and south. By the 6th century, the land was divided into multiple competing polities: Kent, Sussex, Wessex, Essex, East Anglia, Mercia, and Northumbria, each a small kingdom with its own chieftains, customs, and ambitions. The Roman cities fell into disrepair, roads crumbled, Latin faded, Christianity receded into the margins. In its place arose the heathenry of the newcomers, gods like Woden, Thunor, and Tio, rites held in groves and sacred hills. Yet even as they took the land, the Anglo-Saxons themselves were changing. Their society began to settle, to build. Farmers plowed the land, smiths forged tools and weapons. Laws were codified in runes and later in writing. And by the end of the 6th century, a new wave began, this time not of warriors, but of missionaries. In 597, a Roman monk named Augustine was sent by Pope Gregory the Great to convert the Anglo-Saxons. He landed in Kent and was received by King Ethelbert, whose Frankish wife had already brought whispers of the Christian faith. Within a few years, Augustine had baptized the king and begun the long, slow process of re-Christianizing the land. The story of the Anglo-Saxons is one of displacement and rebirth. They came as outsiders to a land left vulnerable by imperial retreat. They pushed aside a Romanized world and replaced it with one that was simpler, harsher, but also deeply creative. Their language would become the root of English. Their laws, their customs, their poetry, Beowulf, composed in the centuries that followed, would form the bedrock of English culture. And though they came as pagans, they would soon shape one of the most devout Christian realms in medieval Europe. Thus, the British Isles did not fall to flame, but to tide, a long, slow tide of migration that brought new gods, new kings, and a new people who would, in time, call the land their own. In the age of migrations, even the sea could not shield an island from the turning of the world. Chapter 8. Ostrogoths and Visigoths, rival brothers amid ruins. The Goths, once united by culture and kinship, had long since splintered into two great branches, each carrying the same name but walking vastly different roads. The Visigoths, as we've seen, wandered westward, sacking Rome and forging a kingdom in Hispania. But their eastern kin, the Ostrogoths, lived a parallel and equally dramatic saga, one that would unfold not in the wilds of the frontier, but in the very heart of former empire. The Ostrogoths had been the first to fall before the Huns. Their kings were slain, their people scattered or absorbed into the terrifying war machine of Attila. For decades, they lived in the shadow of Hunnic rule, fighting in Attila's armies, migrating where they were told, existing without freedom. But after Attila's death in 453, the Hunnic Empire collapsed like smoke. What remained was opportunity. The Ostrogoths, leaderless but not broken, began to regroup. By the late 5th century, a new figure rose among them, Theodoric. Born around 454, raised as a hostage in Constantinople during his youth, Theodoric straddled two worlds. He spoke Latin and knew Roman ways, yet he remained a Gothic warrior at heart. Tall, charismatic, and skilled in both politics and battle, he was the ideal leader for a people adrift between identities. The Eastern Roman Empire, based in Constantinople, had its own designs for the Ostrogoths. Emperor Zeno, seeking to solve two problems at once, encouraged Theodoric to march west and overthrow Odoacer, the Germanic ruler who had deposed the last Western emperor and taken control of Italy. Zeno hoped to rid himself of both men in a single stroke. Theodoric accepted. In 488, he led the Ostrogoths westward, across the Balkans, and into Italy. The campaign was long and bitter. Odoacer resisted fiercely. For 3 years, Italy became a battleground of rival barbarian kings. Cities were besieged, alliances broken. But in 493, Theodoric triumphed. He invited Odoacer to a banquet to negotiate peace, then killed him with his own hand. With Odoacer dead, Theodoric declared himself ruler of Italy, but rather than burning it down, he rebuilt. From 493 to 526, he ruled as king of the Ostrogoths and, de facto, as king of Italy, though he styled himself not as emperor, but as Patricius and Rex. His court was based in Ravenna, a city of mosaics and marshes, once imperial, now Gothic. Theodoric's reign was a rare moment of equilibrium in the chaotic 5th and 6th centuries. Though a barbarian king, he preserved Roman institutions, employed Roman administrators, and protected the rights of both Goths and Romans. His reign was marked by legal reform, religious tolerance, and architectural revival. Aqueducts were repaired, senatorial privileges maintained, and learning protected. But beneath the surface, tensions simmered. The Goths remained Arian Christians, while the majority of the Roman population, especially the bishops and elite, adhered to Nicene Christianity. The churches stood apart, rituals divided, and while Theodoric sought harmony, his successors lacked his tact and authority. Meanwhile, in the east, a new emperor had risen, Justinian. Ambitious and devout, he dreamed of restoring the lost glory of Rome. To do so, he needed to reclaim Italy. In 535, just 9 years after Theodoric's death, Justinian launched his campaign. The Gothic War, fought from 535 to 554, was one of the most brutal conflicts of late antiquity. The Byzantines, under the brilliant general Belisarius, landed in Sicily and advanced north. Rome was besieged multiple times. Ravenna fell. Cities changed hands. Populations suffered. And the once thriving Italian peninsula descended into ruin. The Ostrogoths fought valiantly under later kings like Witiges and Totila, but their power waned. By 554, the war was over. The Ostrogothic kingdom was extinguished. Italy was technically under imperial control once more, but at a terrible cost. Its population decimated, its cities shattered. And what of their Visigothic cousins in Hispania? They, too, had their trials. Internal strife, religious tension, and conflict with the Franks and Byzantines weakened their hold. Yet their kingdom endured longer, becoming a fixture of post-Roman Western Europe until the Muslim conquest in the 8th century. The two Gothic peoples, once branches of the same tree, had carved separate legacies. One sought permanence in the West and found it in Iberia. The other tried to restore Rome in Italy and perished in the effort. Together, they embodied the tragedy and ambition of the age. Peoples caught between worlds, building kingdoms atop crumbling stones, dreaming of a place in history not as destroyers, but as heirs. And for a brief, flickering moment, they succeeded. Chapter 9. The Battle of Nations. Catalaunian Plains and Europe's Fate. In the long twilight of the Western Roman Empire, as kingdoms rose from ashes and emperors dwindled into shadows, there came a moment when the entire fate of Europe seemed to hang in the balance. Not in a senate, nor in a court, but on a wind-blown plain in the heart of Gaul. It was here, in the year 451, that two great forces met in a clash so fierce, so mythic in memory, that later generations would call it the Battle of Nations. The location was the Catalaunian Plains, likely near modern-day Châlons-en-Champagne in northeastern France. The protagonists, Attila the Hun, the scourge of God, and a desperate coalition of Romans, Visigoths, Franks, and other allied peoples. The Western Empire, fragmented and fragile, had reached its breaking point. Attila, with a reputation carved in blood and fire, had already swept across much of Europe. Cities in the Balkans had burned. Entire tribes had fled before him. Now, in 451, he turned his gaze westward, to Gaul. Attila's motivations remained debated. Perhaps he sought to pressure the Romans into giving him land and tribute. Perhaps he wished to test the Western Empire's will. Perhaps it was vengeance, or simple appetite for conquest. Whatever the reason, his army moved swiftly, crossing the Rhine and laying waste to cities in its path. Metz, Reims, Troyes. Paris, according to legend, was saved only by the prayers of Saint Genevieve. But the real target was Orléans. It was there that the Roman general Flavius Aetius, last of Rome's great commanders, gathered his forces. Aetius, though Roman by rank, was no stranger to the world of the tribes. He had once lived as a hostage among the Huns, knew their language, their customs. Now he stood against them, forging alliances with the very peoples who had once fought Rome. The Visigoths, under King Theodoric I, the Burgundians, the Franks. Old enemies became uneasy allies. It was a union born not of love, but of necessity. The armies met on June 20th, 451. Attila's forces, possibly numbering over 200,000, faced a slightly smaller but well-coordinated coalition. The exact size is lost to time, but it was one of the largest and most diverse battle formations Europe had seen in centuries. Huns, Ostrogoths, Gepids, Scyrians on one side, Romans, Visigoths, Franks, Alans on the other. The battle raged until nightfall. Horses trampled bodies. Arrows darkened the sky. Shields shattered. The center of the battlefield became a whirlpool of steel and blood. Theodoric, the Visigothic king, was killed. Accounts differ whether by a spear or by falling from his horse. Yet his death did not break the Visigothic resolve. On the contrary, it drove them harder into the Hun lines. Attila's army faltered. Rather than risk total defeat, Attila retreated to his camp, where he prepared for a final stand. According to the historian Jordanes, he had built a funeral pyre within, vowing to throw himself upon it should the camp be breached. But Aetius held back. He chose not to press the siege, wary of provoking a cornered beast. He allowed Attila and his forces to retreat beyond the Rhine. The battle was over, but the war was not. Still, the impact was enormous. Attila's aura of invincibility had cracked. The fragile Western Roman Empire had, for the moment, survived, and Europe, at least for a generation, was spared from becoming a dominion of the Huns. But why did Aetius let Attila go? Some say it was strategy, fear that destroying the Huns would leave the Visigoths too powerful. Others suggest he hoped to use Attila again, as a counterbalance. Whatever the reason, it was a choice that rippled across the coming years. Attila would return, this time invading Italy in 452. But he would not reach Rome. Disease, famine, and diplomatic maneuvering halted his campaign. He died the following year, reportedly from a nosebleed on his wedding night. His empire, built on his charisma and ferocity, fractured almost immediately. And what of the victors? Aetius, hailed as the savior of the West, was assassinated in 454 by the Emperor Valentinian III, who feared his power. Theodoric's sons would continue the Visigothic legacy in Hispania. The Western Empire itself, despite this brief revival, continued to wither, collapsing in earnest just 25 years later. The Battle of the Catalaunian Plains was not a triumph in the Roman sense. It did not restore empire, did not end the threat forever. But it was a hinge point in history, a moment when the fury of the steppes collided with the fading order of Rome, and Europe stood on a knife's edge. Had Attila won, the map of the continent might have redrawn entirely. But he lost. And in that loss, the old world limped forward into a new one, battered, bleeding, but still breathing. Chapter 10. Attila. Life and Death of a great conqueror. In the fading light of the Roman world, one name rose above all others, spoken in fear, in awe, in trembling admiration. Attila. To some, he was the scourge of God, sent to punish a corrupt and crumbling empire. To others, he was the last great conqueror of the ancient world, a ruler of horsemen, a breaker of empires, a phantom whose shadow stretched from the rivers of China to the gates of Rome. Yet behind the myth was a man, a warrior king, whose rise and fall defined an age of endings. Attila was born around the year 406, likely somewhere in the great steppes between the Don and the Danube. His early life is mostly legend. He and his brother Bleda were nephews of Rua, the previous Hunnic ruler. Raised among the elite of a fierce and mobile society, Attila would have learned to ride before he could read, to shoot a bow before he spoke more than a few words. The Huns were a nomadic people, their lives bound to the rhythm of the herd and the will of the sky. They did not build cities or carve monuments, but they shaped history through motion and terror. In 434, Attila and Bleda assumed joint leadership of the Huns. Together, they negotiated treaties with the Eastern Roman Empire, demanding gold, trade rights, and tribute. Rome paid, hoping to buy peace. For a time, it worked. But in 445, Bleda died. Some say naturally, others say by Attila's hand. From that moment, Attila ruled alone. He was no mad barbarian. Attila was cunning, strategic, and deeply aware of the power of fear. He kept Roman envoys in awe, sometimes impressing them with lavish feasts, sometimes terrifying them with brutal displays. He demanded tribute and gifts, but also engaged in diplomacy with emperors and bishops. He styled himself not as a mere chieftain, but as a ruler equal to Rome's sovereigns. In 447, he launched a devastating campaign through the Balkans. Cities were razed, rivers choked with bodies. Constantinople itself trembled. The Eastern Empire sued for peace, offering thousands of pounds of gold annually. Attila accepted, but his ambitions turned westward. By 450, he claimed that the Western Roman Empire owed him more than money. He demanded the hand of Honoria, sister to the Western Emperor Valentinian III, who had allegedly sent him a plea for rescue from an unwanted marriage, along with her ring. Whether she meant it as a proposal or a political gesture, Attila treated it as a claim to half the empire. The following year, he invaded Gaul, leading to the legendary Battle of the Catalaunian Plains. Though not a clear defeat, the battle stalled his advance and wounded his myth of invincibility. Yet he was not finished. In 452, Attila invaded Italy itself. He crossed the Alps with an army that moved like fire. City after city fell. Aquileia was so thoroughly destroyed that it would not recover for centuries. Refugees poured south. Panic spread. Rome, though weakened, braced for its final breath. And then, history took an unexpected turn. According to tradition, Pope Leo I met Attila near Mantua. The exact words exchanged are lost, but something, be it diplomacy, fear of disease, or logistical strain, persuaded Attila to turn back. Rome was spared. Attila returned to his stronghold across the Danube, Less than a year later, in 453, he died. The manner of his death is as enigmatic as his life. On the night of his wedding to a young bride named Ildiko, Attila reportedly died in his sleep. Some say from a nosebleed, others whisper assassination or poison. His men, stricken with grief and confusion, buried him in secret. Legend says his body was placed in 3 coffins, 1 gold, 1 silver, 1 iron, and laid to rest in a riverbed. The water was diverted for the burial, then returned to its course, and all the laborers who performed the task were killed to preserve the secret forever. With his death, the Hunnic Empire collapsed almost immediately. His sons fought among themselves. Subject peoples rose in rebellion. Within a generation, the Huns had vanished from history, leaving behind no cities, no scriptures, only fear and the broken memories of their enemies. Yet, Attila remained. In the minds of medieval chroniclers, he became a monster. In Germanic sagas, a villain, or sometimes a noble adversary. In Eastern lore, a ghost of the steppe. His name lingered like thunder after a storm. What made Attila different was not just his violence, it was his vision. He challenged Rome not as a petty raider, but as an equal. He treated emperors as peers, not masters. He demanded tribute not as a beggar, but as a sovereign. And for a fleeting moment, he bent half of Europe to his will. Attila was the exhale before the silence, the last great horse lord of the ancient world, riding ahead of a new age. When he died, the age of nomadic empire receded. The old world, already cracking, shuddered one final time, and the long dawn of medieval Europe began. Chapter 11. An empire fractured. The final days of Western Rome. By the mid-5th century, the Western Roman Empire no longer resembled the mighty force that had once ruled from Britannia to the sands of Syria. What remained was a fragile skeleton, its limbs twisted by civil war, its heart weakened by debt, and its arteries clogged with distrust. The grandeur of the Forum, the discipline of the legions, and the harmony of Pax Romana had become little more than ghosts in marble. The eastern half of the empire, ruled from Constantinople, still stood, resilient, wealthy, and relatively stable. But the west was a land unraveling. Its emperors ruled in name more than in fact, often propped up by barbarian generals, their thrones dependent on alliances more than armies, their cities surrounded by lands no longer truly under imperial control. From the Alps to the Pyrenees, from the North Sea to the Sahara, the map of Rome blurred and bled. After the sack of Rome in 410, the empire never truly recovered. Though the city remained symbolically potent, real power shifted to other centers: Ravenna, Milan, Aarhus. The court of the Western Emperor became increasingly peripatetic, its strength resting not in legions, but in diplomatic skill, bribes, and the sword arms of foederati. Barbarian leaders, men like Stilicho, Ricimer, and later Orestes, held more sway than the emperors they served. These were not foreign invaders in the traditional sense. They were Roman-trained, sometimes Roman-born, wielding both loyalty and leverage. And yet, their ambitions often outgrew the hands they were meant to serve. Civil wars became a constant rhythm. Usurpers rose and fell. Provinces broke away in everything but name. Britain had been left to fend for itself decades earlier. Hispania, Gaul, and Africa had slipped away into the hands of Visigoths, Burgundians, and Vandals. The imperial tax base collapsed, coinage debased, roads went unmaintained, cities declined. One of the last figures to rise in this twilight was Flavius Aetius, the skilled general who had defeated Attila's advance in Gaul. Yet even Aetius, celebrated as the last of the Romans, met a tragic end. Murdered in 454 by the very emperor he had preserved, Valentinian III, who was himself assassinated the following year. Power had become a poisoned cup. In 475, a Roman general named Orestes took control of the Western court. He placed his young son, Romulus, on the throne, a child emperor whom history would cruelly remember as Romulus Augustulus, Little Augustus. He reigned for less than a year. In 476, a Germanic warlord in the Roman army, Odoacer, deposed him. There was no great battle, no sack, no civil collapse, just a resignation. Romulus was sent into quiet exile in Campania. Odoacer declared himself king of Italy and sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople. The Western Roman Empire, by then little more than ceremony, was over. Yet Rome did not vanish in that moment. The idea of Rome endured, deeply embedded in law, religion, architecture, and the imagination of Europe. The Eastern Empire, what we now call the Byzantine Empire, continued to flourish for nearly 1,000 more years. Latin remained the language of the church, of scholarship, of authority. The Senate, astonishingly, continued to meet in Rome under barbarian rule, even as its power dwindled into symbolism. What collapsed in 476 was not civilization, but centralization. Power had become local. Lords and bishops replaced governors. Fortified villas replaced urban forums. The rule of law gave way to the rule of oath and sword. The world was fragmenting, but also reforming. And so the Western Roman Empire passed not with thunder, but with weariness. Its final breath was not a scream, but a sigh, whispered among ruins, echoed in cloisters, remembered in the dreams of popes and emperors yet to come. Even in its death, Rome planted seeds. The kingdoms that emerged from its bones would remember it not just as a memory, but as a model. And in that memory, something of Rome would always live on. Chapter 12. Northern Roads. The Movements of the Slavic Tribes. While the western provinces of the Roman Empire crumbled and the great migrations of Germanic and nomadic peoples reshaped Gaul, Italy, and Hispania, another quiet movement was taking place far from the Latin-speaking world, across the river valleys, forests, and marshes of Eastern Europe. Here, in lands untouched by Roman legions and overlooked by Roman chroniclers, the Slavic tribes began their slow, enduring spread. Their rise was not sudden. Unlike the dramatic invasions of the Huns or the kingdom-building campaigns of the Goths, the Slavs emerged in history more like a tide than a thunderclap, gradual, consistent, and persistent. Their origins are still debated, but most scholars trace their early homeland to the forested region between the Oder and the Dnieper rivers, in what is now eastern Poland, western Ukraine, and southern Belarus. In the 2nd and 3rd centuries, they were scarcely mentioned in Roman sources. Known loosely under names like Veneti, they lived in small, kin-based communities, spoke early forms of the Slavic language, and practiced subsistence agriculture, animal husbandry, and forest foraging. Their societies were decentralized, no great kings or armies, but strong bonds of clan and ritual. But in the 5th and 6th centuries, as Germanic tribes departed westward and southward under pressure from the Huns and others, a vacuum opened across much of Central and Eastern Europe. Into this vacuum, the Slavs began to move. They migrated not with banners and battles, but with plows and hearthstones. Their expansion was subtle and rooted in survival, clearing land, building timber homes, cultivating millet and rye, raising pigs and goats. Their mobility was high, their needs simple. Forests were their allies, rivers their roads. Over time, their communities multiplied, spreading into the Carpathians, the Balkans, and beyond. By the early 6th century, the Byzantine Empire began to take notice. Slavic raids appeared along the Danube frontier. These were not the shock cavalry of the Huns, but waves of light infantry, nimble, elusive, and unarmored, who crossed rivers and hollowed out logs and struck suddenly at villages and outposts before vanishing back into the woods. The historian Procopius, writing from Constantinople, described the Slavs as tall, strong, and weathered. He noted their egalitarian social structures, their reverence for rivers and nature spirits, and their resistance to centralized rule. Unlike the Germanic kingdoms that mimicked Roman institutions, the Slavs remained rooted in the land, in oral tradition, in the old ways. And yet, they were far from primitive. They forged iron tools, crafted pottery, and developed complex oral laws and customs. Their belief systems were rich with animism and ancestor worship. Their speech, though diverse, formed the basis of what would one day become the great Slavic language family: Russian, Polish, Czech, Serbian, Croatian, Bulgarian, and many more. One of the great turning points came in the late 6th century, when Slavic tribes, some allied with or subjugated by the Avars, a powerful nomadic confederation, began pushing deeper into the Balkans. They crossed into modern-day Serbia, Bulgaria, and Macedonia, even reaching the Peloponnese in Greece. The Byzantine response was inconsistent, sometimes military, sometimes diplomatic. But the Slavs proved difficult to repel. Their decentralized society, lack of strategic centers, and constant mobility made them an elusive foe. By the early 7th century, much of the Balkans, once solidly Roman, had become Slavic in language and population. Roman cities still stood, often abandoned or reduced to fortresses, while the countryside filled with new voices, new rhythms, new rites. The transformation was quiet but profound. In the north, Slavic expansion continued along the Vistula and beyond the Baltic. In the east, they mingled with Finno-Ugric and Baltic peoples, laying cultural foundations that would later support powerful future states: Kievan Rus', Poland, Bohemia. And throughout it all, they carried no banner of conquest, no claim to empire. Their power lay in numbers, resilience, and adaptability. Where others imposed kingdoms, the Slavs rooted communities. Where others came with fire, they came with seed. Their legacy would blossom slowly, century by century. In time, Slavic peoples would build great cathedrals, write in Cyrillic and Latin, wage wars, and shape Europe's destiny. But in the migration period, their story was one of emergence, not empire. A great reshaping not by kings, but by countless hands tilling new soil under open skies. In the northern roads of Europe, where silence once reigned, the voices of the Slavs began to rise, soft at first, then steady, until they formed a chorus that would echo through the ages. Chapter 13. Cultural Imprint: How the Migrations Shaped European Civilization. When we think of migrations, we often imagine movement of people, of borders, of armies and kings. But the true legacy of the migration period lies not only in shifting maps or broken empires. It lies in the culture that followed, the deep imprint left by wandering tribes upon the soil, spirit, and structure of what would one day become Europe. In the centuries following the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, the new world that emerged was not a return to darkness, but a transformation. Roman traditions did not vanish overnight. They merged with the customs, languages, and institutions of the so-called barbarians. What resulted was neither purely Roman nor purely tribal. It was something new, forged in the fires of upheaval and survival. First, there was language. Latin, once the imperial tongue, remained, but it changed. Spoken Latin evolved as it blended with the Germanic and Celtic languages of the newcomers. This fusion gave birth to the Romance languages: French, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, and Romanian. Even in areas where Latin did not survive as a spoken language, it continued as the language of the church, the law, and learning. Germanic languages, brought by tribes like the Franks, Goths, Vandals, and Lombards, took root especially in the north and center of the continent. They evolved over time, influenced by Latin vocabulary and Christian concepts. English, born from the mingling of Anglo-Saxon tongues and later Norman French, is itself a direct child of the migrations. Then, there was law and governance. The Roman legal tradition, with its codified principles and civic institutions, was not erased. It was absorbed, adapted, and reinterpreted. Tribal codes, such as the Lex Salica of the Franks or the Visigothic Code, were early attempts to create ordered societies grounded in both custom and law. These codes often borrowed Roman structures, even as they preserved the oral traditions of their own people. Architecture, too, bore witness to continuity and change. Roman roads, aqueducts, and bridges were repaired, reused, and sometimes abandoned. Villas became fortified farmsteads. Cities shrank, but did not disappear. New sacred architecture emerged, wooden churches at first, then stone cathedrals shaped by both Roman basilicas and local traditions. Christianity, once persecuted under Rome, had become the unifying faith of post-Roman Europe. Its spread owed much to the migration period. Many barbarian rulers converted, some to Arian Christianity, others to Catholicism, bringing with them entire populations. Missionaries traveled with migrants, carrying gospels instead of swords. In time, the church became the most stable institution in Europe, preserving knowledge through monasteries and shaping the moral codes of the emerging kingdoms. The migrations also brought a new warrior ethos. The Roman citizen soldier gave way to the noble warrior, bound by loyalty and oath. This idea of comitatus, a bond between lord and retainer, would later evolve into feudalism. The sword, once merely a tool of battle, became a symbol of honor, identity, and rule. Kings were crowned not only by bloodline, but by the blade and by divine right. Even art changed. Illumination replaced sculpture. Oral poetry flourished. Beowulf, the Song of Hildebrand, and other epic traditions preserved heroic ideals, tribal memories, and mythic pasts. Symbols from pre-Christian cultures were reworked into Christian iconography, blending old faiths into new meanings. The migrations also affected gender roles and social structures. Tribal societies brought with them a mix of patriarchal and communal norms, some more egalitarian than others. Women in certain Germanic societies had rights to property and legal standing that would later diminish under feudal rule. The fusion of Roman and barbarian values reshaped family, inheritance, and the concept of kinship. Most profoundly, the migrations altered the idea of identity. In Rome, identity had once been civic. Civis Romanus sum, I am a Roman citizen. In the post-Roman world, identity became ethnic, tribal, and local. You were a Frank, a Saxon, a Burgundian, or you were Christian, or Arian, or pagan. Europe became a patchwork of overlapping loyalties, not just to empire, but to blood, to faith, to land. But slowly, over centuries, this fragmentation would also give rise to a shared European consciousness. The memory of Rome, its laws, its roads, its glory, remained. The Church, speaking Latin across many tongues, maintained a common spiritual language. And the cultural imprints of the migrations, songs, stories, customs, and laws formed the bedrock of European identity. Thus, the migration period was not an ending, but a layering, a palimpsest written over time. Rome did not fall. It faded, transformed, and echoed into new shapes. The tribes who crossed the rivers and wandered the roads were not just destroyers. They were builders, too. Out of their paths grew the Middle Ages, and beyond them, modern Europe. Not as Rome had planned it, but perhaps as history, in all its chaos and creativity, intended. Chapter 14. Legacy of Chaos, the Birth of Borders and Peoples. When the dust of the migration period began to settle in the 6th and 7th centuries, Europe had become a land profoundly changed. What had once been a vast, relatively centralized empire was now a mosaic of shifting kingdoms, tribal territories, and religious domains. The chaos that had torn through the continent did not leave a wasteland. It left something new. The beginnings of modern Europe's nations, its languages, its borders, and its people. The term barbarian no longer applied. The migrating tribes had become settled societies, and their chieftains had become kings. These kings no longer roamed the roads. They issued edicts, minted coins, sent envoys, and ruled lands they now called their own. Legitimacy no longer flowed from Rome, but from ancestry, divine favor, and the sword. The Franks, under the Merovingians and later the Carolingians, consolidated their control over Gaul and much of Central Europe. Their kingdom, expanding and evolving, would eventually become the foundation for modern-day France and Germany. Under Charlemagne, in the 8th century, the Frankish world would once again dream of empire, one shaped by Christian unity and royal conquest, not Roman law. In Hispania, the Visigoths had carved out a durable kingdom that blended Roman and Germanic traditions. Though eventually toppled by the Muslim conquest in 711, their cultural legacy would remain deeply embedded in the Iberian identity. It was in the crucible of reconquest, centuries later, that Spain and Portugal would be born. Italy, once the core of the empire, became a contested prize. The Ostrogoths ruled briefly before being overthrown by the Eastern Roman, Byzantine Empire in the Gothic Wars. But Byzantine control was tenuous and short-lived. By the late 6th century, the Lombards, a Germanic people, invaded and established their own rule. Italy fragmented into duchies, papal lands, and city-states. Rome, once capital of empire, became the seat of a spiritual empire, the papacy, whose influence would ripple across the next millennium. Britain, once a distant province of Rome, was now home to a patchwork of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms: Northumbria, Mercia, Wessex, Kent. The Celtic peoples had retreated to the fringes: Wales, Cornwall, Ireland, and Scotland, preserving distinct identities, languages, and cultures that endure to this day. From these fractured beginnings, the kingdoms of England and Scotland would one day rise. In the Balkans, Slavic tribes, often in alliance or conflict with the Avars and later Bulgars, became the dominant force. Though often lacking centralized states, their presence reshaped the linguistic and cultural landscape of southeastern Europe. Over time, these Slavic roots would give rise to the Serbs, Croats, Bulgarians, Slovenes, and others, each with their own path to statehood and identity. And what of the Huns, the Alans, the Gepids? Some vanished into the tide of history. Others merged with larger groups, leaving only names in chronicles and echoes in legend. But even they contributed to the evolving genetic and cultural fabric of the continent. Borders, once drawn by Roman generals, were now etched by migration and memory. Rivers, mountains, and old roads became the new frontiers, not just of territory, but of culture and language. Tribal boundaries hardened into political ones. Kingdoms began to formalize, issuing charters, codifying laws, collecting taxes, and raising armies. Identity was increasingly tied to land and lineage. To be a Frank or a Saxon, a Burgundian or a Lombard, was now to belong to something larger than a tribe. It was to be part of a people. And yet, in many ways, Europe remained a land in flux. Loyalties were still local. Fealty was personal. Power depended on charisma as much as legitimacy. Christianity, now the dominant faith, served as a binding force, but also as a point of contention between Arian and Catholic, Latin and Greek, Pope and Patriarch. The migration period had swept away the old world and left in its place the scaffolding of the new. Its legacy was not merely political, but cultural. Oral traditions began to be written down. Epic poetry, law codes, chronicles, and legends flourished. From these, Europe would build its identity, not from Roman marble alone, but from the wood and iron of its tribal past. We often think of chaos as destruction, but in truth, chaos is also creation, wild, unpredictable, and full of potential. The migration period was chaotic, yes, but in that chaos, the peoples of Europe found new homes, new voices, and new names for themselves. They were no longer Romans or barbarians. They were something else now. They were Europeans. Chapter 15. The Dawn of a New Europe. By the close of the 6th century, the great migrations had slowed. The furious motion of peoples, of Goths and Vandals, Huns and Franks, Angles and Slavs, had begun to settle into place. Borders, once blurred and bloodied, now began to crystallize. The earth, long churned by hoof and wheel, felt quiet again. And from this stillness, a new continent began to rise. Not merely a patchwork of kingdoms, but a different idea of Europe altogether. Gone was the unified world of Rome. In its place stood something fragmented yet fertile, raw but rooted. A Europe no longer ruled from a single marble throne, but by many thrones, carved from wood, set in halls lit by fire, surrounded by warriors sworn by oath rather than law. These were not emperors, but kings. Not legions, but war bands. And yet, in their own way, they were no less builders of civilization. The old Roman provinces had become the seeds of new realms. In Gaul, the Frankish kings blended Roman governance with Germanic strength, laying the first stones of France. In Hispania, the Visigoths cultivated a kingdom where Roman law endured in Gothic tongues. In Britain, the Saxon chieftains raised timber fortresses and called themselves kings. In the East, the Slavs and Bulgars began to shape the cultural core of Eastern Europe, even as the Byzantines held fast to their memory of Rome. But more than territory had changed, minds had changed, cultures had intertwined. In the ruins of amphitheaters and villas, churches now stood. The Latin tongue, once the voice of empire, evolved into French and Spanish, Portuguese and Italian. The tribal languages that once echoed in forest glades now carried the weight of prayer, law, and song. Christianity, spread by missionaries, monks, and converted kings, had woven itself deeply into the fabric of daily life. Monasteries became beacons of learning, preserving what little remained of Roman letters and Greek thought. Illuminated manuscripts were copied in silence while the world outside roared with the birth pains of feudalism. Bishops sat in council with kings. The church offered not just salvation, but structure, a skeleton of unity beneath the body of difference. The very idea of Europe was changing. No longer a periphery of Rome, it was now becoming something of its own, a place of layered identities, Roman and Gothic, Christian and pagan, farmer and warrior, a land of borders, but also bridges, between past and future, between memory and myth. And still, the echoes of the migrations lingered. The memory of Attila, of Theodoric, of Clovis and Alaric. These names passed into legend, into saga, into the long dreaming of a continent rebuilding itself. The cities may have changed hands, the languages may have shifted, but the stories remained, Tales of origin, of wandering, of conquest and kinship. These became the foundation upon which medieval Europe would rise. Even in darkness, light remained. Even in ruin, rebirth was possible. By the 7th century, this new Europe stood on its own trembling feet. It was no longer Rome. It was not yet Christendom. It was something in between, restless, uncertain, full of contradiction. But it was alive. And from this dawn, the Middle Ages would emerge, not as a regression, but as a renewal. A time of castles and crusades, of cathedrals and commerce, of plague and poetry. A world where the memory of migrations would live on in the very bones of its people, in their borders, their names, their faiths. The migration period had passed, but its legacy was everywhere, and in the soft light of that new morning, Europe began again. Thank you for listening, friend. Please subscribe and leave a like. Your quiet support helps us keep crafting peaceful journeys for you. Until next time.